Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the show, in this segment, I am honored to bring media scholar Dr. Bill Yousman to the program. Bill has done so many amazing things in the media studies world over the years, and we've been honored to know him at Project Censored and include a couple great chapters that he's written over the years for us. Most recently, in the State of the Free Press 2025 book. And we're going to talk about this piece today on 11 Theses on Disinformation, with apologies to Karl Marx. And of course, years ago for the 40th anniversary book, Bill wrote a great piece on Who's Afraid of Critical Media Literacy, talking about the importance of critical pedagogy in media studies. And again, today we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the project now, and we're delighted to have Bill here with us to talk about the state of the free press and our disinformation ecosystem. Let me give a proper introduction here. Bill is a professor in the communications and media department at Sacred Heart University. In New England, his research focuses on media and construction of racial ideology, critical media literacy, and the relationship between media and democracy. Yousman's scholarship has been published in many academic journals and edited volumes. His monographs include primetime journals and edited his monographs include primetime prisons on U.S. TV, representation of incarceration, and the Spike Lee enigma, challenge and incorporation in media culture. He is co-editor of the award-winning anthology series Gender, Race, and Class in Media. Yousman is former managing director of Media Education Foundation, another great organization, and he's a regular panelist on WNPR's The Colin McEnroe Show. Bill Yousman, welcome to the Project Censored Show today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Mickey.
Yeah, it's we're way overdue, and I'm really happy that we were able to make some time to talk about a piece that you did for our last book on State of the Free Press 2025, where we're still talking about the specter of dis, malinformation, news abuse, propaganda. As Steve Bannon has said, the mission of the Trump administration is to flood the zone, right, with so much nonsense that the Fourth Estate can't even possibly keep up. So, Bill Yousman, let's talk a little bit about this. We don't have to go through all 11 of the theses if you don't, want to get that granular, but there's a number of things that you really remind us about while we're critically examining and taking in information. You remind us of some of the ways and tactics that people are fooled, and you give us some things to think about of how better and more critically interact with the media. So talk to us a little bit about some of your expose on disinformation.
Yeah, so, when I started writing that piece, I was thinking about how in 2016, with Trump's election, all of a sudden, people started paying attention to, whatever they called it, post-truth or fake news or, propaganda, whatever the terms are that were being used. All of a sudden, people started paying attention to this as if it was something new, which, of course, you're a historian. And of course, that this has been with us for a long time. So, I was thinking about that. But then after a few years, I started to notice how some people were really dismissing the idea that disinformation, which is the term that I like to use the most, it was a real problem. And of course, you had people on the right who were dismissing this because, you know what their framing was, that this was just an attack on the Trump administration and, a left-wing, liberal hoax and, all of that stuff. And so that wasn't all that interesting to me. But what I was interested in was how some people on the left also started to make the argument that it wasn't as big of a problem and that it was more of sort of like a neoliberal framing of what was going wrong in the country. And so what I wanted to do was, look, I'm a Marxist, right? And I wanted to...
Are we allowed to say that?
Uh-oh. Called, Charlie Kirk's wife.
Yeah.
What I wanted to do was I wanted to take a dialectical approach to
Mhm.
trying to understand these differing perspectives. And so I sort of playfully, went back to Marx's 11 Theses on Feuerbach, for the title of the piece. But what I really wanted to do was examine the tension between the idea that disinformation is not really a problem, and what I see as the reality is that it's not the whole problem, but it is a substantial part of the political, social, cultural, economic turmoil that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not an overnight thing. And you already mentioned it's not new. We've been saying that for years, but the terminology that kind of gripped the culture, 2016, the Oxford Dictionary word of the year, post-truth, right? And then if you want to bookend it with last year, it was brain rot. So those are some, from Trump to Biden to Trump, back to Trump. And this year, of course, rage bait is the winner. Something's going on in our culture. So disinformation isn't new. Misinformation, let's just remind our listeners, is when information is mistakenly given, right? Everybody makes
Right.
mistakes. And in the
Sure.
fourth estate, we have retractions, we have corrections, because this is a way of maintaining public trust, right? We're
Right.
like, hey, we made a mistake. We spoke too soon. We didn't know something. I mean, look, and that still creates issues and problems, but nevertheless, misinformation should be allowed to be corrected. Disinformation is the intentional spreading of false information or knowingly
Correct.
spreading it, right?
Correct.
Malinformation is a little newer term that talks about how information can be set out that is it's actually factual information, but it's not in its entire context, or there's something missing. So the information might look accurate, but it's arguably misleading. And at Project Censored, we've called that news abuse for a really long time.
Hmm.
But these are different kinds of propaganda that exist in our media
Hmm.
ecosystem, right? And so you mentioned disinformation as being one of the more problematic, and censorship is really, it's really almost a requirement of a lot of disinformation, because it involves the deliberate suppression of truth or factual information, right? And by
Right.
spreading something that's not true, you're suppressing something that is. So, Bill, I mean, that's a big broad topic for us to go off on, but you talk about this in the chapter on disinformation is not, the source of all of our political problems, but it's a big one. You talk about how disinformation can't simply be attributed to only foreign provocateurs. While those are a problem, we have our own corporate media propaganda here in the country. So you really go down a lot of you go down the list, specifically looking at some of the problems of disinformation. Maybe just unpack a few of those, or say a few things about where we are in the disinfo climate now, where it seems to be almost more than ever. I hate to use cliches, but we're seeing the zone flooded with outright false statements, if not half truths at best, pretty much on the regular, from corporate media, from politicians over social media platforms. Let's talk a little bit about that, and what are some things that people can do, not to safeguard per se, I don't want to use that language, but to navigate it, to deconstruct it, to better understand it and move through and beyond it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree with you that I think it's just getting worse all the time,
Mm.
and that technological developments are really adding on to the problem in some really significant ways. I didn't write that much about AI in that chapter when I was writing it, but it's become every single day, it seems like it's becoming more and more of an issue where now I can just easily on my own computer, sitting right here, in my living room, download some software that would allow me to create a very authentic looking video of you, Mickey, right? Talking about how you changed your mind about Trump. You think he's really like a great guy. You think that all the things he's doing are necessary for making America great again.
I can
And
get
I
a
can put
different
it up.
hat, right? I could.
Right, I could put a different hat on you. It sounds like you. It looks like you, and I'm going to put that out on social media, and I'm going to get all your friends pissed off at you, right? um, so I didn't even start to touch on that yet. And so I'm going to have to like keep writing this as things keep getting worse and worse, and technology does certainly play a role in this. One of the things I talk about in the chapter is that we've always had propaganda, we've always had disinformation, but because of social media, because of smartphones that we're all carrying around, the entire media environment in our pocket now 24/7, and things can go viral, that it's not a new problem, but it's a more intense problem than we've ever had before. And then the other thing I want to pick up on quickly from what you just said is the relationship between disinformation and censorship. One of the criticisms from the left is that by labeling things as disinformation, you're more easily able to suppress them and censor them. And so you can have, somebody like a Hillary Clinton, talking about, that something Amy Goodman said on Democracy Now! Was fake news or was disinformation, or things of that nature. And therefore, that would help to suppress challenging ideas, critical ideas coming from independent media. And I think that's true. And I think that's a real concern. And at the same time, I thought it was interesting that you said disinformation can be its own sort of type of censorship, because what it's doing is it's suppressing reality. And I think a perfect example of that happened subsequent to me writing this chapter, which was during the vice presidential debates, when JD Vance was talking about this complete nonsense about Haitian immigrants killing people's cats and dogs and eating them. And when challenged by the moderator, his response was, "I thought we agreed we weren't going to fact check." Right? So here he is just blatantly lying, just this story that had no basis in truth whatsoever. And when called on it, right, he wanted to invoke censorship in terms of, don't call me on my nonsense. And so I think that's sort of like a perfect sort of example of how these things actually can work hand in hand. We always have to be very concerned about not misusing the concept in order to suppress critical thought, but at the same time, I think take into account the way that disinformation itself helps to suppress critical thought.
Yeah, I mean, what a disingenuous claim. "Oh, I thought we weren't going to fact check." I mean, it's incredulous that someone would even have the audacity to think, let alone say out loud.
It's so blatant now,
Yeah,
right?
it is exactly that, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit more about. That is that it is like saying the quiet parts out loud from on high, right? And
Hmm.
and saying incredibly racist things like the Haitians eating the pets. I mean, these are racist tropes about immigrant populations that go
Yeah.
way back in this country's history. I
Or
like
this
to say that it's
tirade Trump just went on about Somalia,
yeah, I like to
right?
say that it's dog whistling through bullhorns, right? It's like
It's the
it's
megaphone.
it's a
Yeah.
megaphone of this kind of speech that then they'll say, "Oh, you're trying to." Well, then they'll flip it around again and say, "Well, we're not allowed to say that. We're not allowed to quote say the truth
Hmm.
about immigrants and so forth." And then, of course, you've got the Kellyanne Conway school that'll come back to it and say, "Well, those are alternative facts, Bill.
Alternative, yeah.
These are our
Yeah, that
alternative
was
facts."
that was right back from his first inauguration.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what
Yeah.
I mean is that they are so disingenuous about engaging in any kind of good faith debates. People, particularly in the MAGA crew on the upper echelons of government. We just had Stephen Miller spouting nonsense about immigrant populations the other day and how and the economy, connecting things that had no connection together whatsoever. So they're just hell bent on promoting these xenophobic agendas, and disinformation is part of that messaging, right? It's a big part of that messaging because many of the things they're saying are false, and even some of the things that they might be saying that are true on the face of it lack historical context and would definitely be more what we call malinformation. But again, let's look at some approaches to what do we do about this, right? What do we do about the fact that we now have both parties, and I don't want to both sides it and pretend that it's equal because Trump obviously this is like a modus operandi of their administration. But Hillary Clinton just recently making completely false and baseless claims about student activists. and them believing the fake news of TikTok that was actually corroborated information and news, just not reported by the corporate media. So I want to talk with you a little bit more about what that looks like and how both Republicans and Democrats have argued that censorship is the solution, right, for this kind of stuff. How do you see these efforts to censor certain narratives as another part or another layer of the problem of disinformation, maybe rather than a solution?
Yeah, so thesis number 5 in my piece is government intervention and or corporate censorship, because
Ah,
I think sometimes people forget that government censorship is a real threat, absolutely 100%, but there is also private, for-profit business oriented censorship of
mhm.
ideas as well.
Which
So
we call
so
that censorship by proxy oftentimes, right?
right.
Yeah.
By neglect sometimes,
Yeah,
by
yeah, yeah.
refusing
Mhm,
to to
mhm,
to
mhm,
to go to certain places.
mhm, mhm.
So government intervention and or corporate censorship is not a solution um, to disinformation. And one quote that I use in that section is from Naomi Klein. And Naomi Klein says, yes, there is an information problem, but points out we can't expect our tech overlords to solve it. And the quote from her is, the spread of lies and conspiracies online is now so rampant that it threatens public health and quite possibly the survival of representative democracy. The solution to this informational crisis, however, is not to look to tech oligarchs to disappear people we don't like. It's to get serious about demanding an information commons that can be counted upon as a basic civil right. In other words, right, censoring content is not the answer. But but at the same time, giving media corporations free reign to pursue whatever profit-seeking practices they please is also detrimental to the health of the public sphere. And so what I think, a long, long time ago, people started to write about media literacy, specifically critical media literacy that's not afraid to take on the sources of power in our society as an alternative to censorship. And I'd like to say we've come up with some even better ideas since then, but that's kind of a bedrock idea that I know resonates with you because I hear you talk about it often a little bit. We've got to go back to you know looking at the fact that disinformation can't work with an educated populace, or at least it can't work as well.
Mhm, mhm.
Disinformation thrives on ignorance in the same way that mold thrives on moisture.
We love the
You know,
poorly educated, as Trump said.
yes, yeah, no, that's a Trump quote. A JD Vance quote is the professors are the enemies. Which that's personally offensive to both you and me. But and so I think part of the problem is that we have such a media saturated environment. Children start living in that media environment even when they're pre-verbal, right? And yet we've never in the US taken that seriously. We've never had, right from K through 12, you know, regular, yearly immersion in understanding, critically thinking about the media environment. And I really mean K through 12. It's never too early to start talking about that, right? You can talk to really young children about how the toys that are advertised on TV don't look the same when you actually take them home and take them out of the package, right? That's a really rudimentary and elementary idea that you can do with really young children, but then it can grow from there and you can adjust it as their own educational background and maturation continues to develop. And so, I think that's where we have to start. And then the other piece that I would add to that is we've got to address the political economy of the media and we've got to address corporate ownership and media consolidation and there being fewer and fewer diverse sources. We've got to truly invest in public media. One of the recent things that has happened is that the Trump administration has taken away funding from, public radio and television. And not that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was perfect. Certainly, there's been lots of criticism of them from the left. And yet, I think we would agree that we need to have an actual, vibrant, public funded media, not corporate, not private, but public funded media. And we've never actually invested in that the way we should in the US.
No, we haven't, Bill, and that's a shame. And I'm again definitely a fan of K-12 critical media literacy education. We wrote The Media and Me, right, as an effort to try to fill this huge gap. I mean, we basically have a society where students are sort of just given free range with like a lot of this technology and these platforms and tools and gadgets and phones and tablets are put in their hands without any real instructions about what we're handing over and data harvesting and privacy issues and so many other things, including screen addiction. I mean, there's so many things that we just have failed to prepare young people for. And it's like a real time experiment that's not going very well, particularly for younger people, I would say. And so we definitely need uptick in critical media literacy education at all stages, not just at the college or university level, but literally K-12, like you said. And the other factor of that is that we don't really have a public media infrastructure in this country, despite even the hoopla of, as you very well stated, Corporation for Public Broadcasting wasn't all that, but it was. It was a thing. And look, I mean, you and I grew up watching that stuff. We grew up watching these kinds of shows. We grew up listening to that kind of programming, and it wasn't all bad at all. There were some incredible things that were on there. And I think it's also important that you pointed out criticism from the left. There's been criticism from the right. Well, there should be criticism. And that often then is another indicator that maybe public media in the United States, as flawed as it was, wasn't all that bad, which is why it was a target, which is why it
A
was a
hundred
target of
percent.
the right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
100%. You take something like the Frontline documentary series,
Yeah.
right? Doing really, really great work, but it takes money to do that
And
work.
time.
I'm a Marxist because I'm a materialist. I understand that, it's not enough to just have these great ideas. Like those ideas have to be funded. And, the more that we have to rely on private funding, the more compromised that can be.
Yeah, it's true. And look, we have a controlled demolition going on at the Department of Education right now with,
Sure.
a billionaire from the wrestling world. I mean, Eleanor and I have a segment we do called, well, is this the best we can do, that that looks at who's in charge of some of these things in federal government. And my goodness, the qualifications they lack fill books and tomes. But this
And
is
that's
a
on purpose, right?
yes,
That's
go
on
with that,
purpose,
please.
right?
Go with
You
that.
you 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 put the people in charge of these departments who their whole ethos is antithetical to
Yes.
what the mission of the department is. That doesn't happen by accident,
Yeah, the government
right?
doesn't work, and we're going to prove it.
Even in the first Trump administration, right, when they put the guy from Exxon Mobil,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
in the State Department,
yeah.
you know what's going on here when you put anti-environmentalists into the EPA. That this is controlled demolition. People are very upset about the demolition of like a section of the White House, and okay, fine, right, but they should be more upset about the demolition of
The
the
public
actual
square.
infrastructure that keeps us as an open free society.
Yeah, it's amazing, man. I mean, if we can, and again, this is getting back to the attention economy. And I think that that's a very real part of the digital media era, and that
Right.
we haven't really equipped people with, I think, enough background awareness and skill sets about how to navigate and attenuate some of the challenges we face day in and day out, back to flooding the zone, phones, constant information beaming at us from all over the place. Um, let's spend a few minutes, if we could at least, because you do end your piece, and of course we talk about this all the time. The point is to change it. The point is that, well, let's fill the information space with the stuff that students need. Let's do what we can to create some kind of a more robust public media, even in the face of the adversity. right, that we're experiencing here now with 7 billionaires controlling all media moguls, right? When we see public education being gutted, critical thinking essentially being attacked somehow, is that to think critically and independently is part of the problem because people aren't just going along with the proper narratives. We're seeing the establishment press bemoan that they're losing control of narratives. We're seeing billionaires buy up social media to try to keep control of the public mind that way. Bill, let's change it. What are some things that we can do and that people are doing that really do make a difference, right? And because there are many folks in the independent journalism world that are really writing stories that matter. There are educators that are making a difference in the classroom. So, I think that it's important that we replatform, amplify, and remind folks that there's a lot of people doing it and a lot of places to go to get support for these kind of things.
Yeah, so at the end of the chapter, as you say, like I try to at least address this a little bit. And one of the things I say is that confronting where we are requires research, analysis, critique, education, but it also demands activism, right? And it means that we have to work toward reining in the power of both big government and big corporations. And I offer a quote from the media researcher Victor Pickard. This is the second time today I'm invoking Victor Pickard. So, hey, Victor,
Well
shout
worth
out
it.
to you.
Yeah, well
Doing
worth.
great work.
In fact,
And and and,
amazing.
and so the quote that I use is transforming the US media system into a democratic force requires a robust policy program of regulating or breaking up information monopolies, creating public alternatives to commercial news media, and empowering media workers, consumers, and communities to engage with and create their own media. And so it's a multi-platform approach. Now the problem is that we first you have to change the government, right? Because we don't have people in place who have any interest in doing that whatsoever. And I think it has to start on a local level, right? I think we pay so much attention to national elections, and look, for good reasons, right? There are certain things like the Department of Defense, which they've now renamed the Department of War, right? At least they're starting to tell the truth about that, I guess we could say. You know, so that's important. But to really get people who are going to be transformative, I think has to start at the local level. One of the things that's really been imperiled is local news.
Yeah, news
And
deserts.
so,
Yeah.
right, exactly. And so, what I think we have to do is we have to approach this as a multi level, multi platform crisis. And so, activism, politics, electoral politics, education, all of this has to be part of the mix in starting to address this in the first place. Getting people, in office who actually recognize these problems and are willing to, to make changes and to not just accept, the huge donations that keep them as really, just serfs for, the big industries, whether it's media or fossil fuels or pharmaceuticals or whatever it might be.
So we certainly have challenges before us, but we also have, I think, a lot of hope, and there's a lot of positivity in critical media literacy education and teaching media literacy across the curriculum. I also think that the independent media are doing a great job filling those voids. College
Yeah,
campus
no, that's an important
newspapers,
part of the
right?
picture. Yeah,
Campus newspapers too often do a good
yeah,
job filling in some of the news deserts. So there are some things that are working. And again, you mentioned Victor Pickard, his book Democracy Without Journalism. I couldn't recommend more highly. And also,
that's what I was just quoting from. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and of course, the Roosevelt Institute study that Victor just did with a couple of other media scholars on the political economy of U.S. media system, excavating the roots of the present crisis. That's at the rooseveltinstitute.org from early December. And again, there are people doing important work and giving us blueprints for what needs to be done. Bill Yousman, you're another one of the folks that's there on the front lines telling us what needs to be done, and you're doing the things that need to be done. And so it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Bill, professor in the Communications and Media Department at Sacred Heart University. Bill, anything else you want to share with folks about where they can follow your work or get more involved in anything you're up to?
Yeah, I'm a professor at Sacred Heart University, so you can go to their website and you can find my profile page, and it lists a bunch of the stuff I've done and a bunch of the stuff that I continue to work on. I'm always happy to engage in these conversations. I have to say, Project Censored is one of those organizations that I've been following for longer than I'd like to admit, because then I have to reveal how old I am.
Yeah.
But it's organizations like that, like what you guys are doing, what you're doing, at Ithaca, with the Park Center. There are little islands of hope throughout, what might seem like a very stormy sea. And shout out to all of you folks who are doing that work on a daily basis.
Yeah, important to do. And Bill Yousman will definitely have you back on the program. There's certainly a lot of things to discuss. We appreciate all the good work you're doing. And again, we'll have you back on sometime soon. So thanks for joining us today.
I always enjoy it. Thanks for having me on, Mickey.